This is the Black Knight. Hello, YouTube. I'm testing the automated voice recognition system and also the immediate charged particle effects on satellite operations. I want to present some history, but as I discussed on 11 September 2001, one of the problems I was having with the Qualcomm operations is this very video that I'm making in front of this camera as of this date, 2017, which is the 1st of April 2017. I couldn't quite relate to why this video that's being made could not be uplinked and upstreamed to Voyagers 1 and 2 and then be sent right back to my truck. And of course, a lot of things were going on at Ground Zero operations on 11 September 2001. But it took me a little while to realize that the computer technology of the 20th and 21st centuries is still really in its primitive estate. And Gene Roddenberry actually dealt with that issue on his infamous TV series Star Trek, when they would simply walk to the computer and talk to the computer and interact with the computer using their own voice modulation. And of course, I discovered, much to my chagrin, that the automated voice recognition and response system is not fully functional. I learned that immediately when I was there at and for NASA operations in Houston, Texas on 11 September 2001. At that time, I was employed as an over-the-road driver for Atlas Carriers Incorporated, which is now defunct. And I want to spend some time addressing these issues, dealing with those charged particle effects, all of the fluctuations and all of the interferences for our extremely low frequency operations to the very low frequency operations that caused, of course, the loss of the Space Shuttle Columbia on 1 February 2003. But of course, dealing with the scientific aspects of it, it's because the ionospheric currents, say at 100 kilometers all the way to the VLF 60 kilometer radio waves that are being transmitted by AM modulation. When you add the concurrent velocities of the speed of light, in this case, we're dealing with the ideology of coming from within the sun, traveling at the speed of light, which is 186,000 miles per second, to transmit both the audio and the video waves so that we can receive those communications at our receiver towers. You're also having to deal with the triad of the alpha, beta, and gamma rays in the ionospheric conditions and currents. It has to be locked in such a way that you have clear channel of communication. Back in the old school that I'm from, it was all analog, VLF, ELF, UHF communications, and of course our Air America antenna was high on top of Empire State Building on 28 July 1945. Most people are aware of American Broadcasting Corporation, as well as Columbia Broadcasting System and National Broadcasting Corporation, but they don't very frequently remember Dumont. Mr. Alan B. Dumont himself put a lot of money in the very systems that are employed by NASA operations today. And I was very heartened, by the way, and I want to acknowledge that when President Trump got behind NASA and gave his full White House support, this is heartening news, because all of you that are employed in the NASA operations, coming from the outside myself, only concerned with my role as Black Knight #1 in defense of planet Earth, I'm going to spend a little time here giving a little bit of history, even though for, the old school, there's a whole new generation coming up. And I guess what I ultimately hope will be viewed in the future, because, who knows? This could be my final video. I hope not, but there seems to be a lot of problems, as I said, with the Qualcomm prototype that we were trying to hardware and hardwire into contract with Kenworth, because that was my idea for my personal trucking company. I just came to the place where I decided I'm not even going to turn a wheel unless it's Kenworth. And the same thing with the Qualcomm prototype. And thanks to C.L. Werner and his paperless logging, electronic logging system, this is where the trucking industry was going into the future. And of course, whenever you're dealing with an industry like trucking, you're going to deal with, of course, all of the federal bureaucracy and the political ramifications. And it's no secret that as far as where Washington, D.C. is, politically speaking, they're about 100 years in the past, where the rest of us, we're considering, okay, what is this Qualcomm going to look like in the future? And that's been my pet project ever since before 11 September 2001, because of satellite communications. But to give an overview of the historical realities, I go back all the way to the Vanguard satellite, which was launched 17 March in 1958. And that being stated, I want to deal with the concept of the possibilities that the emitted signals may at some point be picked up, in what we would consider past time. So if we go back to the Vanguard satellite, launched 17 May 1958, we all should be aware that President Dwight David Eisenhower is the oversight committee of all of the operations that were going on in NASA. And of course, we are all aware that NASA is a civilian operation. It's not military. But at the same time, as we learned from FEMA 911 operations, we have to keep our awareness and alert levels honed to a state of absolute perfection, because when you're dealing with international continental ballistic missiles and the things that relate to our national defenses, it all has to marry together in certain wavelength cycles and patterns. And then, of course, if you go back before our Vanguard satellite system, which was launched 17 March 1958, we can go back to February of 1958 with Explorer 1. And of course, our initial projects, some have, in the aftermath, considered why they were doomed in their initial launches, because of the various things that were not considered, dealing with the ELF, VLF, and ionospheric conditions. Everything has to be, launched on time with ideal conditions. And of course, we've learned by past disasters what happens as the aftermath of tragedies such as the loss of the Space Shuttle Challenger on 28 January 1986, as well as the Columbia upon its re-entry point in the Earth on 1 February 2003. We remember that in October of 1957, the Soviet Republic launched Sputnik at 20.005 megacycles at a 5-meter wavelength. And then, of course, you calculate that traveling at 18,000 miles per hour, and also subsequent link it with the 40.002 megacycles. When you're dealing with all of those megacycles and megawatts, the modulation of the vocals of the mortal vocal cords is at 20 hertz. So I've tested this in the last 20 years, hoping, against all hope, I guess, that when my voice modulation would be picked up through the automated voice recognition and response, it's at least I hold the view that in the future, you know, our future scientists and our future generation is going to pick that up and say, Dracula, welcome, I bid thee adieu. Because in the 11 years that I've been, you know, trying to work out and beat out all my frustrations with this Qualcomm prototype that we intended to work with and contract with Kenworth, the tractor trailer manufacturer, with all of the various mitigating circumstances, and when I was called upon by the U.S. Secret Service to, you know, take the things that I had learned firsthand as a result of the FEMA 911 Ground Zero operations, and to see how we could hone it to perfection, that in the future a lot of these disasters, you know, involving, you know, the terrorists and those that could pose a national threat as well as an international threat, how we could get a much better grounding to be able to divert any potential threats, especially related to the Pentagon. And I have to acknowledge that I am where I am today with all due respect and thanks to Major General Michael Aquino and the active Department of Defense Pentagon operations of the Temple of Set. And then I just want to shift my conversation, because I'm considering the fact that if this video is picked up on 1 February 1958 and President Dwight David Eisenhower is sitting there, I'm considering the fact that he's not, you know, briefed with all of the scientific technical data that NASA would be privy to in 1958. So I just want to take a moment and acknowledge that on the 20th day of January of 1969, Richard Milhouse Nixon was inaugurated President of the United States of America. And just a couple of months after that, on 28 March, President Dwight D. Eisenhower died. So just think of the shock value of that, of all of this, what we used to refer to as the UHF snow, and you're trying to lock in a clear channel of communication, and then all of a sudden this video comes in, which would of course be received in black and white. So they would see the black and white version of this particular video that is made for YouTube, which in 1969 would be far into the future. You're talking 50, 60 years into the future from where they were at that time. But mentioning 1958, that brings another fatal date of 22 November 1963, and we're all now aware of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy, who was assassinated in Dallas, Texas, who, by the way, not by coincidence, initialized the NBC Telstar operations that was made of full use in 1973 when Elvis Presley did his Elvis Aloha from Hawaii TV special on NBC Telstar. And on 22 January 1973, President Lyndon Baines Johnson died. Now, this being the first day of April 2017, our current president, Donald J. Trump, is getting behind all of our efforts to bring together anything that we can utilize to bring the current society up to speed and basically produce a more intelligent generation in the future that hopefully won't make the same mistakes that have been made in past times. And of course, one of the great innovations in science and space technology is the fact that now we have civilian companies that are, actually far advanced where NASA was 50, 60 years ago. They're already moving into basically what Deep Purple referred to as space trucking, to go up and actually link to the Mir International Space Laboratory. But we keep in mind all of these details because I'm, in effect, addressing two audiences. I'm addressing the potential audience that may pick up this broadcast if, and I want to emphasize if, it goes through that sound barrier, which we've already years ago broken through the sound barrier, and potentially if it transmits the video at the speed of light and breaks through a what I would call the time continuum, and it's actually received and picked up and documented as Black Knight 001, that should have the same effect of appearing and disappearing, appearing and disappearing, and do that on a repeated sequence of events, so that it basically identifies itself and says, I'm here. And I've been here before Sputnik 1 was ever launched, because, as you know, the Russians made history by becoming the first national government to launch a man-made artificial satellite that successfully orbited Earth. And then, of course, as far as astronaut John Glenn, he was the first that was on board the manned spacecraft in the United States of America that successfully orbited the Earth. And there the space race took off. But there's a lot of things I would like to say, but I want to shift my conversation now to deal entirely with the topic of Satanism, because in more recent news events, we've been hearing a lot about the same old reports of quote-unquote satanic ritual abuse. The first thing I want to say in regard to that is that's all just some stuff that people come up with and concoct, because I could just as easily make the case and call it Christian ritual abuse. Why they always have to, and this has been done in the 80s. Do you know how many, I say thousands, if not millions of dollars have been spent on investigation of quote-unquote satanic cults, and all of the mythos of, Satanists being out there with human sacrifices, and, all of the cloak and dagger, smoke and mirrors that always they seem to lay at the door of the Satanists, because, they know nothing about our craft, and they know nothing about the satanic tradition. So I'm going to just try to condense it down into a form. The very seal on the Satanic Bible is published by Anton LaVey as my personal seal. It was created in 1964, and in effect, what it reveals, even though it was hijacked by Anton LaVey and his so-called Church of Satan, which was liquidated for legal reasons. That very seal basically, in effect, says that the ideal satanic union would come at 11:15 a.m. on 16 June 1964 in such an alignment that it would open and close the door in this world as far as Satanism was concerned. It was used on the frontispiece of a book published in 1964 by Maurice Bessy before it inevitably was hijacked by Anton LaVey, which is, you know, for all intents and purposes, trite and trivial now. But to me personally, it is my personal sill of Baphomet. So you can kind of open the door, Leviathan, Baphometus, and go through all of the various invocations that are related to that satanic convocation. And I will just end this transmission by identifying that the blessing and the consecration of those that live by this law, do what thou wilt, shall be the whole of the law. As I do will, so mote it be. As I do will, so mote it be.